All right, this video is going to go pretty quickly, so please pause when you need to take notes. And you should be working on answering the questions on the extra practice for fiscal policy standard practice worksheet with 15 questions on it. If you don't have that, you can find it on Schoology. So let's start with a review of what's GDP. GDP is the total dollar value of all goods and services produced over a specific time period. It's everything that is produced in an economy, usually in a year. Aggregate demand is just all of the goods and services that are purchased in an economy in a given time. So it's the total demand for all final goods and services at various price levels. So it's everything that's purchased in an economy. GDP is everything that's produced. Aggregate demand is everything that's purchased. And so it's often referred to as the demand for GDP at various prices. So you can see it on the graph there, and at high prices, if everything is really expensive, people don't buy very much of anything. But if everything is cheap, people buy a lot of everything. And we have a formula for calculating aggregate demand that is C plus I plus G plus NX. C is household consumption, I is business investment, G is government spending, and NX is net exports. So if you add all of those things up in an economy, that is everything that gets purchased in a year. Aggregate demand, what everybody purchases in a year, is used to estimate GDP, everything that is produced in a year, because everything that's bought in a year is about equal to everything that's produced in a year. And so this CIGNX is used to estimate GDP, but really it stands for aggregate demand. But they're all basically equivalent, and that's okay. The difference between deficit and debt. A deficit is the difference between revenue, how much money some organization or government takes in, and spending, how much they spend. And usually it's when you spend more than you take in. So in the U.S., the 2014 GDP, the total value of the economy was $17.4 trillion. And the government made about $3 trillion in taxes. They took in about $3 trillion in taxes, and they spent about $3.5 trillion. So you'll notice they spent more than they earned, the government did, and that means that there was about a 0.48 or a 0.5 trillion, that's almost $500 billion deficit. That's money they spent that they didn't have in income. The debt is just how much in total we have borrowed. And our current GDP, again, is about 17.4 or 8 trillion. And our current debt, the amount of money that our government has borrowed and owes other people, is 18.2 trillion, which is more than we make in a year. So it's like if Mr. Wood or I go out and buy a house, we will probably spend more on a house than we make in a year, and we just have to pay it off over time. The problem is, in our government, we continue to run deficits, and we keep adding to it every year instead of paying it off every year. Multiplier effect. Multiplier effect is the idea that for every dollar spent, some of it gets saved and some of it gets re-spent. So let's look at an example. Imagine we're counting all the spending in the economy. We're estimating GDP for the economy. Mr. Body Sparrow gets paid $1,000, and so the aggregate demand, I got paid $1,000 in exchange for my labor, and that is aggregate demand $1,000, because my labor was demanded and was purchased by Cristo Rey when I worked for them. I'm going to save $400 of that dollar, and I spend $600 of that on rent. And now the aggregate demand, as how much was purchased in the economy, was $1,000 originally when I got paid, and then $600 when my landlady got paid. So total aggregate demand is $1,600 at this point. And then the landlady saves $200 of that rent money and spends $400 on a TV. And that means that the total aggregate demand goes up by $400 because she re-spent some of that money on a TV. And so the aggregate demand, or GDP, at this point is $2,000. So that's how the multiplier effect works. The money that's originally spent is someone else's income, and they spend that money, which is someone else's income, and they spend that money, or whatever they don't save. Industrialization is the crisis that classical economics had to deal with. Industrialization in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, when we invented mechanized labor and specialization, and a lot of people moved to cities and we started producing things, steam engine, things like that. And classical economists had to figure out how to organize all this production. And Adam Smith, as we learned, came up with the idea that, well, we should let people just pursue their own self-interest. Try not to get in their way. Let them have economic freedom, because the invisible hand will help make sure that everyone gets what they want. Some government is needed for regulation, but that's about it. So that's what Adam Smith said, and it was a response to industrialization. Business cycles will fix themselves. Government shouldn't try to make decisions about the economy. We should let people do that. But then the Great Depression hit in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And classical economists, they kept saying, well, just let it fix itself. But it wasn't fixing itself. And so we had to come up with something else to do. In the Great Depression, there were bad investments made, banks started failing, and there was eventually high unemployment and a really bad shrinking economy. So remember, this is the equation for aggregate demand. Household consumption was going down in the Great Depression. Business investment was going down. Government spending was going down because they were making less in taxes, and net exports were going down because other countries were also having a depression. And this made the aggregate demand curve shift to the left. People were buying less, and prices were going down, which meant that businesses fired people, and so on. John Maynard Keynes was an economist around the time, and he came up with the idea that, no, we shouldn't let markets fix themselves because people suffer too much, and we can do something about it. So Keynesian economics was born and said that government can and should help stimulate the economy when needed. Government should use fiscal policy to increase aggregate demand until the economy is better. And the policies they used during the Great Depression were to increase spending. They started doing public work programs. They started building hydroelectric dams. They started Social Security to help people get money when they lose their jobs, unemployment insurance, things like that. So these policies helped increase aggregate demand to stimulate the economy and get businesses creating jobs again. And there's risks and rewards to this kind of fiscal policy. One benefit is it helps increase spending in the economy. But the costs include that usually the government has to borrow money in order to do that. And that needs to be paid back down the road. Interest payments can be high, and that's money that they're paying on to the people who lent them the money, and then that's not stimulating the economy. And so anytime you borrow in the current time, it slows down the future economy because you have to pay it back. Automatic stabilizers are programs that increase spending when times are tough and decrease spending when times are good. So let's look at some examples. A progressive marginal tax is a tax that gets bigger the more money you make. So if your first $15,000, you only pay 15% tax on it. But then the next amount of money that you make, you pay 20% tax, and then 25% after that. And then after above a certain amount of money, you pay 35% tax on all the money above, say, $45,000. So this essentially increases the amount of money you pay as you earn more money, and decreases the amount of money you pay as you make less money. So this allows people with low incomes to pay lower tax rates than people with high incomes. And when times are tough, when people are earning less money, they pay less in taxes. And when times are good, when they're earning more money, they pay more in taxes. So it helps out when things are tough, and it slows things down when things are good. Other programs that help automatic stabilize the economy: unemployment insurance. If you lose your job, you get some money so that you can keep spending in the economy. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP all do the same thing. Fiscal policy. This is what Keynes thought the government should do. It's when it's the government's power to tax, borrow, and spend. Okay. Expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy are the two different types. Expansionary is when the government increases spending. Well, we're going to talk about it each in turn. So expansionary fiscal policy, that's when the government expands aggregate demand. And it can do it either by cutting taxes so people have more money to spend in the economy, or increasing spending so that more money is spent in the economy. Or it could do both. It could cut taxes and it could increase spending in the economy. Say Obama decides to pay for everyone's education, and the government will pay for it. Sorry, the phone's just ringing. Unpause it. And we're back. So expansionary fiscal policy, that shifts aggregate demand to the right. it increases spending in the economy at every price. So this is what it would look like. Aggregate demand would shift to the right. Price is on the vertical axis, quantity is on the horizontal axis, and that's in GDP, which just means how much stuff is being bought. And aggregate supply is graphed there also. Expansionary fiscal policy is needed when the economy is shrinking, which is a recession. So when the economy is bad, unemployment is high, people don't have jobs, that's when they need the government to spend more money so that businesses create more jobs, because that policy helps increase aggregate demand. But it can create inflation, because when the demand curve shifts to the right, the equilibrium price rises. Let's take a look at how that works on the graph. So you can kind of see this was the first aggregate demand, and this was the price level. And then the new one, the price level, increases. So prices are going up, and that is the definition of inflation, which can be harmful. Also, the government usually has to borrow money to do it, so it increases deficits and national debt, which, as we talked about earlier, can be a problem when you have to pay it back. Contractionary fiscal policy, that's when government uses its power to tax and spend to decrease aggregate demand or contract it. And they can do that by increasing taxes, means people have less money to spend in the economy, or they can cut their own spending so that less money is spent by the government in the economy, or they could do both. And that shifts aggregate demand to the, yep, you guessed it, to the left. This is what it looks like. People are buying less in the economy, so there is less quantity demanded at every price, and you can see that the price level goes lower. The equilibrium price goes lower, and this means that prices go down. So inflation is not going to be a problem because prices are going down. And if the government is spending less, then it can pay off the debt that it took in the past. So contractionary fiscal policy is needed when the economy is growing. So it's okay if the economy slows down, but we have a lot of debt that we need to pay off. So this policy decreases aggregate demand, but the government can use the money it takes to pay off the debt. It slows the economy down, which can increase unemployment. So we would only use this probably if the economy is doing well and unemployment is low. So let's look at a couple situations. If the economy is slow or shrinking, there's high unemployment and inflation is low, so prices are steady, then we should use expansionary fiscal policy. Because if we have a slow economy, we want to increase spending, so we'll use expansionary fiscal policy. But if the economy is growing and inflation is fine, then contractionary fiscal policy is needed to pay off the national debt. Because we can decrease aggregate demand, and that's okay because the economy is doing fine, and then we can use the money to pay off the debt. So just remember that expansionary fiscal policy creates jobs and can create inflation, and they have to borrow money to do it. Expansionary monetary policy creates jobs and inflation, kind of is the same thing, but it doesn't have to take off debt. Contractionary fiscal policy slows down the economy, but they can pay off the debt. And contractionary monetary policy slows down the inflation, but also slows down the economy. So we'll review monetary policy in the other video, and let me know if you have any specific questions. But I hope you were able to follow along and answer the questions in the practice sheet, and I hope you feel more ready to take the test. And actually, one more thing, I just want to show you this chart. This is another way to think of it. If there is low unemployment, the economy is doing well, and inflation is low, then we can use fiscal contraction because that slows down the economy, and it can then be used to pay off our national debt. But if we have low unemployment and the economy is doing well and there's high inflation, prices are rising, then we would want to use contractionary policies, both fiscal and monetary, to pay off the debt and slow the price increases. If unemployment is high, however, we would probably want to use expansionary policies to help improve the economy, decrease unemployment. But if inflation is high, we would probably want to use contractionary monetary policy to slow prices, and then we could maybe use expansionary fiscal policy to improve the economy.